Game over, man. Game over.
Johnny. You're gonna need a big approach. Why so serious? Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for June 25th, 2024, and I'm Jodie Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
All right, thanks for joining us, everybody. For longtime listeners of the show, you may know simply by hearing my voice, or if you're watching us on YouTube, you can see that I am 2 inches away from death.
You sound great. What are
And
you talking about?
The last 5 days or so have been a complete nightmare.
I am so
They've
sorry.
been terrible. And it's unfortunate because it's the weekend that featured one of, if not my most anticipated film of the entire year.
Yeah. The timing has been very unfortunate on your side.
Yeah, we're talking about my boy, Jeff Nichols. He's back.
He's back. It's about time. It's been a long
about
time since
time.
Loving.
Which was what, 2017?
Was that 2017?
I
that was. I think that
believe
was
so.
the same year as. He had 2 films come out that year, didn't he?
Well, Midnight Special was the year before.
Yeah, maybe that's
That
what I'm
would've been
thinking of. I
2016.
think he had back-to-back films in 2 different years.
Or maybe Loving
Actually,
came out that year. Maybe
I
Loving
think it was.
2016.
I'm actually looking.
Yeah.
I'm actually looking at it here. Loving
Okay.
was a 2016 film because I think I recall that there was a lot of conversation between us film critics at the time. What was the better Jeff Nichols experience that year? And
Yeah.
and there was an equal amount of debate. Obviously, you were a Midnight Special fanatic
Yeah.
at the time, and I think I still prefer Midnight Special of those 2 films. But he is now 6 films deep. I don't think he has a
It's
miss.
not enough. It's not enough.
No.
It's wild that it's been that long. It's
I
been
know.
way too long. I didn't tell this to him, although I guess to preface even that statement, it was a dream come true, an opportunity of a lifetime. I got to interview Jeff last week. Now, this episode is, of course, going out a little later than we really wanted to because I've been on the verge of death over the last 5 days.
Yeah.
But that said, a week ago, I got a chance to interview one of my very favorite filmmakers working today,
Absolutely.
and it was glorious. I will say,
loved it.
I'm
loved it.
glad if I was going to get sick, I'm thrilled that it came after the interview. I would have
I was gonna
been
say,
so
yeah,
upset if I had to miss.
I
because
was
of
going
this.
to say, if there was ever a chance to talk the Bikeriders while you were still, mentally there and physically there, I'm glad
Yeah.
it was for the interview with the filmmaker and not just us weirdos talking about his film.
Yeah.
It definitely worked out in your favor in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. I had such a great time with him. In fact, it went so well. Like, we were simply going. You won't see it in the final edit, but I was so engrossed in the conversation. We were simply going that at one point the publicist had to jump in and be like, "Okay, we got to cut it off. We got more interviews to do." And I, of course, was very understanding, but it just
Yeah.
felt like one of those where we were both in the moment, and it was going so well, and it was fantastic. I could have talked to him for another hour.
Well,
And-
he's one of those personable guys. I was listening to it, and I was actually kind of jealous that I wasn't part of the conversation. It felt like a natural conversation between film fans. It really did.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes those are the best interviews when there's an artist and a critic involved. It doesn't sound like you're just simply asking him questions. And I wanted to pick his brain even further. He just seemed
Yeah.
like the most sincere person to talk to about this art.
He was lovely. He was absolutely fantastic. And you never know how they're going to be. I have heard that
Yeah.
Jeff is very humble and gracious to
Good.
talk to, but obviously this was my first time experience talking to him, and it was lovely, especially because I, of course, had to bring up Midnight Special. I had to.
You had to start with that. You had it in
Had
your
to start
background
with
and
that.
everything. I'm surprised you didn't stand up and show your shirt to him. during the interview.
Well, I didn't want to come off, I guess, too pandering, but I did have to bring it up to him, and I guess to that point of you don't know how they're going to take it. Like last year, I interviewed John Powell, and God bless him, I still love John Powell, and I brought up How to Train Your Dragon as this transcendent score. We talked about it as one of the best of all time.
Yeah.
And just how much I loved it, how much it's, kind of helped change, like my reaction to that series and all kinds of things.
For sure.
And he was very reserved. I don't even know if he said anything back to me other than like maybe a very small thank you back. Because John Powell, though, mostly just didn't say anything. So I did have that a little bit in the back of my mind of, well, he might just hear me talk about this profound experience I had with Midnight Special and simply go, okay, and like do a head nod and then that's it. Yeah. I was prepared for it because of that experience with John Powell. Again, not a knock on him. I still love him.
We all have different personality types. We all engage in conversation in a different way, especially when it comes to art, but that's not emblematic of every artist working in, the Hollywood landscape. Right. Yeah. And I can sort of relate to the John Powell side of it all. I mean, as someone like myself that also plays and composes my own music, if someone comes to me and says they like what I'm doing, sometimes I get a little, I don't want to say embarrassed, but you get kind of timid sometimes. And maybe there was just some humble timidity on his side of things,
that's probably all it was.
Which is fine. That's probably all it was.
Yeah. And that's probably all that it was. So not a huge deal, but the movie itself, not just the score. And I could have obviously talked about How to Train Your Dragon as a movie all day, but John Powell only did the score for those movies.
Right.
Jeff Nichols directed Midnight Special. So I was hoping to have maybe a little bit more of a reaction, or I would have really liked to dig into that more. And, but I was fully prepared to have a quick thank you and then move on. And when he engaged me in it, I thought it was really great. And I don't know if you noticed this or not, but when he was talking to me about it, and he starts off by mentioning that, it was a small film. It wasn't this big box office hit or anything. And then he kind of gets this almost somber look in his face, and he says, "It's my most personal film to date." I
noticed that.
The next 25 minutes simply talking about that exchange, like that line back to me. I wanted to rebuttal so hard, but obviously we were mostly there to talk about and promote the Bikeriders.
For sure.
So I didn't want to get too much into a rabbit hole, but I thought that was really telling, because that film for me is extremely personal, obviously. And it feels like a personal movie, but you don't really know unless you start having those conversations. And maybe even at the time when he was doing interviews, I don't know. Again, it came out in 2016. But
that's 8 years ago.
I had heard him say that. Or at least I remember him saying that.
That's 8 years ago. And the fact that he's still saying that now, I think, showcases that there was sincerity and truth in that. Because that happens a lot when filmmakers and especially actors are in the middle of a promotional streak for their new films, right? They tend to focus on the one they're promoting, and they have great things to say about it. I remember when David Lowery was promoting Peter Pan and Wendy, he was saying it's the best film I've ever made. And that was not true. But the fact that Jeff Nichols is holding this past film of his from almost a decade ago in such high regard for him personally, like that's how you know when a film has some kind of staying power. Yeah. And whether you like the film or not, Midnight Special specifically, you can at least tell it's coming from a deeply honest place.
And that's what I wanted to dig into more. Yeah. Like I wanted to ask him, what is it about it that is personal? One, just to hear him talk about it. And also I would be curious if it's for the same reasons that I do. And maybe they're not. Maybe they're slightly different. I don't know.
Well, could give you a different appreciation for the film. But I think it's an interesting talking point too, because something you guys talked about as well. And for listeners of this episode right here, if you haven't listened to that interview with Jeff Nichols that JD did, you really should. But we're also going to reference some things as we continue this conversation around the bike riders. But something he also said was how the story of the bike riders was something that initially didn't even interest him. It was really trying to find the people behind the story that did interest him. So it's interesting to hear that kind of contrast between his experience making something like Midnight Special that was very personal to him to a story like this where he had to find the reason it became personal to him.
Exactly.
So there is a neat contrast there for sure.
Absolutely. And I guess we can use that as a transition point to talk further about the bike riders. But I wanted to note that I had such a glorious experience talking to Jeff about the making of the bike riders, but also getting to at least give him some reverence and just tell him how thankful I am for making Midnight Special, because it was a profound experience that has truly changed.
You were doing a job interviewing him, but you weren't just doing a job. It was a nice balance there. And seriously, it was a great conversation. You should be proud of that.
So I'm glad that I was able to achieve that before I got really sick. I got really, really sick over the weekend. And I'm
bike
still
riders,
feeling
that's
it.
medicine.
I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. I'm still feeling it, but we're coming out on the other side. And I should hopefully get back to some sort of normalcy here in the next week or so. But the schedule might be in flux depending. So you'll just have to bear with us. And I guess on that same token, because I am, I'm still kind of reeling here a little bit. I am very doped up and trying to make this work. So if I come off a little loopy or I feel I'm mumbling a little bit more than usual, it's just that. It's just that I'm high on drugs and I just wanted to make this work.
We don't condone the use of drugs on this podcast. That's not what we're saying. But JD, I'll also pull you back into reality if you accidentally start talking about Easy Rider or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll bring you back to this movie.
Yeah, and by drugs I mean medicine. But
I know. I'm just messing with you.
Just to be clear, I'm not like taking cocaine or crack and trying to make this work.
Well, aside from actual medication, you had the best medicine by not just seeing the bike riders and talking to Jeff Nichols, but you also had a great hockey victory as well.
Yeah, I'll talk more about that on the main show.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave it there for now. But yeah, there's been some really interesting developments over the last few days. There's no doubt about that. Anyway, the Bike Riders, that is Jeff Nichols' latest film. I do wish that I was a little bit more coherent for this review, because I've been looking forward to this for not just this year, but this was supposed to come out last year before it got moved.
Yeah.
And so this has been on our radar for quite a few years now.
Yeah.
And I'm just glad that he's back. I'm glad that he's back.
Me too.
It's a little late, but again, he's one of my favorites. So The Bike Riders is written and directed by Jeff Nichols, and it stars Jodie Comer, Austin Butler, Tom Hardy, Mike Feist, Michael Shannon, and a few others that come and go. Should we give away the cameo? I mean, I think people know that he's in it, but
that's a good question. That's a good question.
Maybe
Maybe we get to that point later when we feel like we need to talk about it.
Yeah, maybe we can give it away later. Yeah, I think that's very fair. Okay, if you're not familiar with the Bike Riders, after a chance encounter, headstrong Kathy is drawn to Benny, member of a Midwestern motorcycle club, the Vandals. As the club transforms into a dangerous underworld of violence, Benny must choose between Kathy and his loyalty to the club.
Wow.
Okay.
Your sickness made that voice sound epic.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
What did you think about the Bike Riders?
Yeah, I vibe with this quite a bit. I think it's really good. And I know not everyone's going to vibe with it because the marketing certainly suggests a movie that might be more in the company of something like an Easy Rider. Like I said earlier, it's marketing a bike gang film of sorts. And it is that, but it's not. This really is, as you talked about with Jeff Nichols during your interview, it is sort of a hangout movie in many ways.
Yes.
It's very much a testimonial and inspired by true events, something we talked about or didn't talk about here, but you talked about with Jeff, was the testimonials by photographer and journalist Danny Lyon, played by Mike Feist here, and the book that he wrote, The Bikeriders, based on his interviews with the real life Kathy and how Benny was intermingled with that. What was fiction? What was fact based on Jeff taking his own liberties with this story? We might talk about some of those things even further. But it makes for a movie that really is about the conversations that this type of environment would invoke and the idea that people fell in love with. I think that really is the interesting thing about it. Like I said, I was able to vibe with this. I think it's a really good film. It's it reminded me a lot of Goodfellas in the way it's edited. I tweeted that as Goodfellas on wheels, but it also weirdly reminded me of Jane Campion's The Power of the Dog in some ways, the way it treats a sort of like love triangle of sorts and some of the interesting subtext that may or may not be there. And whether you want to see that there or not is entirely up to you as an audience member. It doesn't make or break the film. There is no definitive interpretation on that, but it's almost like those two films joined a biker gang and this is the baby that they made. and I really do like this film. I don't think it's my favorite Jeff Nichols film. I think that'll still go to Take Shelter for me, but this could be one of the more rewatchable ones. I like a lot of these performances as well. We'll certainly talk about that. And in a lot of cases, the characters themselves as depicted here are not the most fleshly written characters, but I think that's what makes them more interesting. We'll talk about that further and how that relates to even your conversation with Jeff on the script writing process, which I also found really interesting. But yeah, I thought this is a really good film. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. I mean, Jeff Nichols rules. What can I say? Of course, I like the film. It is a little bit different for him, though, at least tonally speaking. I was not expecting it to be as funny as it is, but Jodie Comer is delightfully entertaining here. Between the writing, her performance, and some well-timed edits, Kathy delivers some biting humor at times.
She does.
I also think of that moment where the gang is confronted by another biker gang at the park and they get into this brawl. But there's a great shot at the end of it where we simply see everybody from both gangs just kind of hanging out like nothing ever happened. And it is definitely meant to invoke a little bit of levity. And I loved that approach to this film because it is acting as a hangout movie through much of it, especially the first 2/3. And I was perhaps a little caught off guard by its comedic swings. We simply haven't seen that from Nichols before, but I do find them very effective here. What is very Jeff Nichols, though, and you were just talking about this in your opening thoughts as well, is how he once again explores family and how we define it. I think a big part of why the humor works here is because these guys just want to hang out and ride bikes. They get a deep pleasure just being around each other. And there's a natural levity that will come out of that. But as we see in all of Jeff's movies, there are complexities beneath the surface that he wonderfully minds. We'll certainly get more into them as we talk here. However, the obvious dynamic in the film is this unconventional love triangle between Kathy and Benny and Johnny. With Benny at the center and Kathy and Johnny both wanting every bit of Benny. But the great irony is that Benny has nothing to give either way. He's completely distant. He's always stoic, ready to leave at any given point. And it's fascinating to see how that tug of war pulls apart all three characters in very different ways. And that is ultimately the sleight of hand of this film. It's really incredible how the tone of the film can feel like a sledgehammer of a swing in terms of the pendulum going from one side to the other, but you almost don't notice it. Like, it happens so subtly and cleverly that that hangout vibe of the film, when it becomes a little bit more heavy and the stakes are raised a little bit, you really feel for the characters in the conflict that comes about, especially because of these performances, which are great. The performances here are fantastic. So, and Nichols' direction, stellar once again. So, I'm with you. I was a big fan.
Yeah, and much like all of Jeff Nichols' films, it really is a performative piece. Something that he spoke about when you talk to him that I found really interesting is his thoughts on the script writing process. I think he sort
Yeah.
of, in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, said that scripts are really easy, which I think on its own terms, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I see where he's coming from as far as his script writing process and how he makes movies. He likes to
Sure.
see what's on the page as more of a narrative guideline of sorts, and then how he visualizes that is the emotionality he wants to convey. And that's
Hmm.
why his films are very much performative pieces.
Hmm.
You recast any of his movies with actors that are not capable of delivering what he sees and what he wants, his movies really don't work. They feel very underwritten. And in
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
cases, his movies might all be kind of underwritten, and that's what makes them well written. He knows where he's able to fill in those gaps, whether it be in performance or in
Mhm.
direction. And here, with our three main leads, this love triangle we're talking about between Kathy, Benny, and Johnny, on the page, these are not the most well fleshed out characters, but that's what makes them so interesting, because these performances allow us to maybe infer what their motivations are, what their desires are. This notion that both Johnny and Kathy find such interest in Benny for their own reasons, yet it almost seems as though they love the idea of Benny and how he
Mhm.
benefits them, as opposed to Benny as a person who is very despondent, like you're talking about. He is very mentally distant. There's something about Benny that they just find attractive as far as what he represents as opposed to who he is, right? And I find that
Mhm.
really ironic, given that Johnny, played by Tom Hardy, who wants Benny to take over the biker gang, the Vandals, Johnny sees this as his family, but he has his own family. Like, what is wrong with his own family life that he needs to resort to this? These are questions that are not flaws within the movie.
Mhm.
This is what makes the movie so interesting. This is what makes it dramatically compelling, because it's forcing us to have sort of a psychological conversation on what these people are doing and what makes them tick. So
Mhm.
I love how this love triangle is built on more of an idea than it is. There is genuine love involved, but what kind of genuine love? And is there something superficial or kind of selfish about that? And
Yeah.
that's what makes the film, at least in my interpretation, that's what makes it really interesting for me.
Yeah. I think that's really compelling. And I think a dynamic of the film that is a wonderful spin-off to what you're saying
Hmm.
is that the Vandals themselves is a complete facade.
Yeah,
I love the idea that the Vandals start simply because Johnny thought it looked cool in the movies. And
yeah, the
given,
wild one, the Marlon
uh,
Brando thing. Yeah.
yes, and given how things play out in the end, I don't think it was anything more than that. All of the
Hmm.
masculinity and so called bravado here could simply be chalked up to this is what they saw on TV and in the
Hmm.
movies, and they just emulated that. And I
Hmm.
think the biggest piece of evidence for that is that one, as I talked about in my opening thoughts, those opening scenes with the Vandals are loose and kind of playful.
Yeah.
Again, even after getting into a fake fight with another gang, they just hang out and everything's gravy.
Hmm.
Secondly, Johnny doesn't have any real aspiration to become Michael Corleone. The
Hmm.
only time he shows any real force is when Benny, and I think that is important, when Benny is severely injured at a bar,
Yeah.
because it is Benny. His
Yeah.
emotions get the best of him and he reacts out of passion. Aside from that, he's very reluctant to get
Hmm.
into any conflict. And when he
Hmm.
sees that the gang is getting too big for him, he wants to set up a succession plan to get out. It's as if the stuff in the movies is cool until it becomes real. And how the
Yeah.
film breaks down that mindset is really fascinating and ultimately heartbreaking in the end
Yeah.
with how much of that crystallizes. And
Yeah.
to your point earlier about the performances, you're right that a lot of these characters are purposefully underwritten.
Yeah. Yeah. That's not a
However,
negative term to say underwritten here.
exactly. But circling back to Johnny and how he reacts out of passion, when
Hmm.
Benny gets injured, how he's reluctant to get into any sort of conflict. You don't need to write anything for that because you have Tom Hardy. Tom Hardy is able to emulate all of that with perfect precision and clarity without him ever uttering a word. And because it's Tom Hardy, it's a lot of mumbling and grunting, and maybe you don't understand what he's saying. And that's perfectly fine because the performance and the subtlety of it, he is able to emulate those emotions in the character.
You feel it. You don't need to think it. You feel it.
Absolutely. So, I love that about the film, how so much of what takes place here is this deconstruction of what these guys think is cool, what they think masculinity is or should be. When it becomes real, they immediately want to get out, or they really don't want anything to do with it at all. And they each in their own ways, they try to find an escape route. Some of them don't get out.
Some of them don't.
Many of them try to.
Yeah, I think that's a great point there that you're talking about. That makes the film really interesting as this dissection of masculinity. It's really about this difference between perceived masculinity and then toxic masculinity. So really this starts out as what these men see as masculine, as machismo, right? They find that cool. Maybe wrongfully they find that cool. Yet at the same time, the film doesn't necessarily condemn them for thinking that this is cool, because still deep down, they do have a genuine care for each other. There is genuine love and even sensitivity between them. This film is a weird way of having its cake and eating it too, by suggesting the wrong side of masculinity while also showcasing the sensitive side of masculinity that we often like to see in movies that depict these things. And then it gets to a point where this idea starts to expand almost like a virus. And that's where things start to get a little bit toxic, when it builds beyond their control, when too many people latch onto the idea, and when there's too many of these people that have that same motivation and that same idea, that's when they can get dangerous, because now they have some power. And that's where things become unfortunate and tragic, as you're talking about. The third act of this movie, the way that this gang, the thing is, the gang doesn't fall apart, but it also does fall apart. It grows and expands and becomes more of a thing, but it actually becomes more of a gang. It becomes more about the violence. It's interesting to see this movie as basically, if you want to see it as a biker movie specifically, it's about the evolution of what we now perceive as biker gangs, as literally gangs. It may not have started out being about the gang mentality, but it did eventually evolve, or I guess devolve into that. And seeing it in that way, I thought was really compelling too.
Yeah, and it's interesting where that transition takes place. I think that's one of the best scenes of the film as well, because there comes a moment where Johnny is challenged by, I believe the character is Big Jack. And he simply says, "Hey, I have these friends that want to start a chapter. Can we do that?"
Yeah.
And Johnny is, again, he's very reluctant because he doesn't have any real aspirations. He saw something on TV. It looked cool. I want to do that with my friends. And you're right. I think the film goes way out of its way to demonstrate that the camaraderie between these guys is genuine. It's real. They really do love each other, and they care about each other a lot. And that's all it ever needed to be for Johnny. He didn't want it to grow into this huge empire. He did not care to be Michael Corleone. But Big Jack challenges him. He, of course, has to take him up on this challenge. And they have a little duel, which, again, lends itself to a little bit of that levity that we talked about earlier, with how that moment crystallizes as well.
Yeah.
But with Johnny, you see the reluctancy. Like, he just didn't really care. Now, ultimately, he gives in to Big Jack because he just doesn't want to deal with the conflict. I think that's ultimately the choice he makes there is, I don't really want to get myself involved in any sort of real conflict. And he lets them in. And so the gang grows and grows and grows until it becomes this thing. And then we get the campfire scene later on in the film where Johnny just wants to get out. Like, you sense how desperate he is to set up this.
He seems so uncomfortable.
Plan.
Yeah.
So uncomfortable. And that facade is really starting to show itself. You see the cracks in the leather, and it is fascinating how Tom Hardy is able to demonstrate that while still kind of keeping the fabric of the facade together enough that it might not show to the guys around him, but we all know that the vulnerabilities are there. And and again, you don't need the writing to tell you that. It's all in the performance and in Jeff Nichols' direction.
You feel
how those films or those scenes are staged, and it's just fantastic. And I do think much of what we're talking about here does tether to the love triangle and some of the notions you brought to that as well, as far as how there is how there's a little bit of the same thing happening with that triangle.
Yeah, we'll talk about that triangle as well, but one thing I do want to highlight, you mentioned the campfire scene, and in many ways that whole campfire sequence, it's really a few scenes at this campfire party. That whole sequence is more or less the thematic nucleus of the entire film. You take that whole sequence out, the film basically falls apart in some ways, because you have crucial moments that are all more or less doing the same thing. And it's what you're talking about. It's revealing those insecurities in these people without them maybe realizing that they're revealing these things to people. One of them being Michael Shannon's really big moment that's meant to come off as really funny. You talked to Jeff Nichols about this in this interview, where Michael Shannon himself had a different interpretation of that scene. And he said, no, the character's sad. And you sense both of it in there, that maybe this is a last resort for him, this sort of environment that he's in. And okay, should we give away the cameo? I think we're talking about the same cameo, because I think...
Well, we can. I guess before we get there, there's a couple of aspects to that scene before we get to the cameo that we can talk about. Because I do want to echo what you're saying about Zipko is Michael Shannon's character's name. And it is this great moment. It's another fantastic sequence that demonstrates the facade of these characters, because Zipko does demonstrate, if you can even call it that, this machismo that is clearly crumbling anytime he tries to resort to it, which is, it is funny. It is funny to see him kind of, struggle throughout a lot of this film. But here comes a moment where he's just raw and vulnerable and talking about his desire to want to go to Vietnam and his experience of the process of getting rejected and how that made him feel. And the people around him do see it as maybe a little bit goofy because it's Zipko and that's his personality.
That's how he presents it. Yeah.
That's how he presents it. But Michael Shannon's performance is devastating. It is so heartbreaking. Like, you see the pain behind those eyes, and Jeff does such a great job of capturing that. Like, you get this nice little medium shot on Shannon as he starts delivering this monologue, and you really do see the pain there. And it's just a fantastic moment.
Oh yeah, but it's still a funny moment too. It has it both ways. Like, it's funny because of the delivery, but it also suggests this interesting psychological thought that sometimes we will use humor to mask pain. And that might be what Zipko is doing. It doesn't confirm that for us, but through Jeff Nichols' direction, the way he pauses to linger on certain things and let Michael Shannon's performance suggest other things for us, the way that they're working together, it really is a great partnership. It's the reason why they work on so many films together. But they're conveying multiple layers that turn what is very funny on the surface into something way more introspective. And that happens with pretty much every performance here, I feel like, is given that moment to internalize what they're delivering and to suggest multiple layers of something that is certainly not there in the page, and rightfully not there in the page. The artistry of this film is what you can visually get away with as a visual artist. Like, this, movies are a visual medium. That's what they are. And this movie certainly is about that very thing.
I agree. And speaking of, I think that is a great way to transition to the next talking point with that scene. And that is Benny and Johnny, because as Zipko is talking, those two characters move to this quiet space around the corner where Nichols follows them. And it's that moment we've been somewhat teasing in the conversation where Johnny wants to build out this succession plan, and he's talking to it about Benny. But it is an extremely intimately shot moment where the two of them are close. You see shadows on their face. It's almost as if they're becoming one. It is an incredibly intimate moment that evokes how close of a bond they have, even though they might not show it outwardly to each other, and of course when everyone else is around. But Nichols goes out of his way, to your point, visually invoke the intimacy of those two characters and the closeness of those two characters, which is, I think, certainly evocative in terms of the visual appeal, but it's also in contrast to the actual conversation they have. Because as we noted earlier, Benny is an empty vessel. Yeah. He's willing to leave at any point. And as much as he loves Johnny, he's not quite on board with the plans that Johnny wants to have. So there is this interesting tug of war that's happening there in terms of the visuals and the dialogue. But again, the performances are fantastic, and it's one of the most exquisite scenes of not just this film, but of the entire year.
Yeah. I like a lot of what that scene is doing, because it goes back to something I even said earlier, that Johnny and even Kathy, this is where I think the film is really compelling, because both of these characters, Johnny and Kathy specifically, they love the idea of Benny, but in any other film, that would suggest that they don't genuinely love this person, that it's just like a selfish kind of love. And yet somehow the film also conveys the exact opposite at the same time. There is a genuine love for Benny, but there's also a genuine interest in what Benny represents. And the film wants it both ways, and it has it both ways. Johnny loves the idea of Benny and his tough exterior as someone that he thinks could run this club, simply because Johnny doesn't have an interest in growing it any further. It's a selfish reason, but he does genuinely care for this person. You might be able to say the same thing for Kathy for different reasons, but I like that the film is able to have it both ways without focusing on one and becoming a one-sided argument. I think that's a really well-layered way of presenting love and romance in a film like this, which is what makes a love triangle so interesting.
I agree. It's a great moment because it works in juxtaposition. In some ways, simultaneously, it's a great parallel.
Yeah.
Between scenes we see later on with Benny and Kathy. And what we come to see is that both of them want something from Benny that he just isn't willing to give them.
Yeah.
Like he just doesn't have it in him. Like Kathy wants to leave. She wants to get out. He doesn't want to do that.
Yeah.
Ironically, because Johnny wants him to stay and take over, but he doesn't want that either. Like it's this really interesting tug of war that's happening that begins to unravel in these fascinating ways as the narrative unfolds there. But and the visual storytelling in all of that, I just think is sublime.
And I keep thinking, what does Benny as a person, represent for this movie symbolically or metaphorically? Like perhaps as this tough man, this tough exterior that he represents, like perhaps he's sort of the after effect of this masculinity that has formed around this around this biker gang, and how it's evolving into something else, and he was just not ready for that, and now just wants to distance himself from it. There are a lot of things you can infer about Benny. He's, in many ways, he's the least interesting character in the movie, which is what makes him the most interesting character in the movie. It's it's a really interesting way of doing that, and that despondency, that lack of personality in many ways, is what I love about Austin Butler's performance. It's a very dry performance, and if you're going into this movie hoping for really compelling and well-defined characters that leave you emotionally enthralled, this is probably going to disappoint you. It doesn't deliver that type of cinematic language or that kind of emotional language. It's going for a different kind of language that, in a weird way, kind of moves you more as you think about it. It's a movie that, for lack of a better term or phrase rather, it sneaks up on you. And sometimes those are the better movies. They're the more interesting movies, I think.
No, I completely agree. Yeah, I'm with you on that wholeheartedly. I guess to kind of wrap a bow though on the campfire scene, to bring it back to that one more time, because earlier you brought up this cameo that shows up.
Yeah.
I think with all of that other stuff out of the way, we can get to this cameo because I knew he was in the film, but I wasn't. I honestly, I was so into the movie, I completely forgot until he shows up.
I didn't know those teeth were in the movie, but I knew he was in the movie.
Well, it's funny that you say that because, and I joked about this at the end of my conversation with Jeff, but I was immediately reminded of Spring Breakers. I was like, this is the Jeff Nichols version of that.
It's what Alien. What was his name? James Franco's character.
Yeah, exactly. And Norman Reedus, that's who we're talking about here, obviously.
Yeah.
His character's name is Funny Sonny. And look, that's equally a goofy name. Equally goofy name. Like, I just think Jeff is sitting on a gold mine where he could make his version of Spring Breakers with that character.
I'd love to see it.
I would love to see that as well. But like, it reminded me a lot of Alien from Spring Breakers, but just in a Midwestern blue collar Jeff Nichols kind of way.
Yeah. It's gross in some similar ways, at least, externally. It definitely looks like a character that hasn't brushed his teeth nearly as much as he should. But there is a lot of parallels you can make between Norman Reedus here and what we were just talking about with Michael Shannon and Tom Hardy and Austin Butler, because there's a revelation here involving, and I'm again blanking on the character's name, Funny Sonny. There's a revelation involving Funny Sonny as to why he's even here, why he shows up. And it's the one moment of the film where it really starts to deliver a potential thrill, as if this is about to turn into a horror movie. I was on the edge of my seat when he reveals why he's there. And then he more or less just says, yeah, but I'm not going to do that. And while it's also really funny, it also shows that this is all just a facade in many ways, like it was for everyone else here. There's not much of a difference. He comes in from where? California, I think it was.
Yep.
And that type of external masculinity, that facade that we're talking about, still exists way across state lines on the western side of the country. I love that parallel. And it's conveyed in, this is where I think the script is at its strongest. It's conveyed in this dialogue and, of course, through performance as well. But I love how we're able to find those parallels that almost seem meaningless unless you really notice it. But I thought that was a really compelling touch and a nice way to create a parallel between Funny Sonny and the rest of this gang as well.
Yeah, no, I love that as well. I completely agree. I think it works seamlessly with the rest of the film. And it is a great use of the cameo.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really have too much of an impact. He literally just hangs out for the rest of the film, as a lot of these characters do.
Yeah.
In some way. But and I guess even within that context, I find that interesting now that we're talking about it, because at the end of this film, there is a sense of closure with some of these characters, but also a sense of lostness. And I think you really do sense that with Funny Sonny, that this is a guy who just really has no path forward. He's just going to go where the wind takes him, so to speak. And like, I think that tailors very well to what you were just talking about there. But yeah, Norman Reedus he's a little unrecognizable at first, but man, he's fun here. Really
well,
fun.
when you notice it's him, you think he's just here as like an in joke, because in real life, Norman Reedus is an avid biker. So there's a nice little tie in there for sure, but he has more to offer there. There is this sense of closure with some of these characters that the closure is very different between them. Sometimes it's more tragic. Sometimes it's more dangly. Like there are some arcs that just don't conclude, and that's what makes them devastating. I think of someone like, what was it, Wahoo, played by Bo Knapp. For instance, but Wahoo and Corky, I believe, are the two that are sort of left dangling the most, but it's because they too have nowhere else to go. They're just forced to stick around into an environment that they don't even want to be in anymore in the first place, because all of their best friends are now off doing their own things. And it's ironic that they find themselves even more lost by simply staying put. Their arcs remain dangling in a way that when I say it's unfulfilling, I mean that as a compliment. Like sometimes a lack of a conclusion for a certain arc is what devastates you the most. Like the fact that you want to see something else happen from them that isn't given to you is it's like you're reeking for something. It's not there. And their arcs conclude in such a way without that right resolution that it leaves such a bittersweet taste in your mouth. And that's what I think the film is certainly going for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the violence and the gang itself gets out of control to a point where characters have to draw a line in the sand at a certain point. And we talked a lot about Johnny and his succession plan, how he wants to get out Benny, is apathetic and doesn't want to take control of the gang. He doesn't necessarily want to leave and move to Florida either. He loves the guys. And you're talking about how some of them are kind of left dangling at the end of this. Maybe they feel like they're forced to. We don't really know. But then you also get the cockroach character who makes a very brazen decision that still revolves around him being on motorcycles, but it comes through a very different prism. Yeah. And him making that choice, I need to do something better for my family because like you guys, I sense that this is getting out of hand, and how that crystallizes is fascinating. Like you really do see the facade start to break at the seams in these palpable ways, and how they react. I just find it interesting to see the various angles that the film explores.
Oh yeah, there's a point where they're just they're not having fun anymore. There's a point where it becomes real.
It's just not fun. Yeah, it's all real.
Yeah. I love the irony of how Cockroach's arc concludes, that he still finds a way to maintain his love of motorcycles and biking, but in a way that I guess is more officer friendly, if that makes sense. I think that was a really nice touch. And again, I don't know how true it is with some of these other supporting roles that we're talking about. I know when you talk to Jeff Nichols, he obviously talked about Kathy and her relationship with Benny and where that deciphered from the literal tapes that Danny Lyon recorded. But apparently Johnny, played by Tom Hardy, was more fictionalized. So there are elements of fiction and nonfiction working at play here simultaneously. And I'm not saying that is a good or bad thing. I'm saying I don't even care. If it serves the movie, then it rightfully does. But it does leave me curious as to which of these supporting characters are real, and if some of these conclusions that they faced, if these really happen for some of them. But I think that's the sign of a great movie that is somewhat loosely based on a true story, that you do find yourself thinking about that. Maybe you want to do a little bit of research on your own to figure out more of the story. I found myself trying to think about the young kid that essentially takes over this gang, and if there was truth into who that was, who simply is unnamed in this movie. Like who might that represent? And I was trying to think if there was any historical context to that kid and what he did. The film made me want to be more tied to this story, which I think is a great way of telling the story. So it's really great stuff.
I agree. I mean, you really do wonder where these characters are, and if they're inspired by real people, or he's simply taking inspiration from like infusing several characters or several people into one character, as writers tend to do. It could be a little bit of that. Who's to say? But either way, I think he makes it work narratively to fit this movie extremely well. And I guess as we wind down the conversation here, we should probably talk about Austin Butler and Jodie Comer a little bit more, because they are two major stars here for sure. Austin Butler just oozes cool and charm throughout this whole movie as someone who has very little dialogue. I mean, he's stoic. He's this empty vessel, but man, he has a glare that will absolutely seep deep into your soul. It is pretty mesmerizing. Yeah. And it's fascinating how Jeff Nichols was able to shoot many of these shots of him anyway, directly from the book, which I hadn't seen before until someone had sent me some of the shots of Benny in the book. And I could understand immediately why Jeff Nichols was like, yep, that is cinematic right there. Yeah. That's really, really good stuff. So even though, as he said in the interview, he has no affiliation with with biker clubs. He knows nothing about the motorcycle culture. Neither do I, really. But I could understand immediately why he was like, that looks cool. I would love to shoot that on film. And
Yeah.
who better to cast as Benny than Austin Butler, who doesn't need to say anything. You just put a camera on him and just he radiates the screen.
I know a lot of people have already made the James Dean comparison. I think that's certainly fair. But what I love so much about his performance and about his presence here is you never forget that he's here, even though there are long stretches where you never even see him, where it basically becomes more about Kathy and more about Johnny. They might be talking about Benny, but even times they might not be talking about Benny. It might be Johnny dealing with some of the drama of his own boys that doesn't even involve Benny. And yet somehow we always get the sense that Austin Butler is on screen, even if he's not there. We know he's somewhere in the scene because somehow he's just that powerful of a presence. The way he looks at you, if in the previous scene, if he just happens to look at some character, we see the way his eyes focus on something. Like, it just stays with you so that you never forget that he's in this movie, which is the sign of a great performance, because if you forget that he's here at all, the movie starts to get a little uneven in the wrong ways. But yeah, it's a great performance because you never forget about his presence. It's almost ghostly in a weird way.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. He's fantastic. And again, the whole idea of Nichols and his actors being able to and purposefully conveying everything you need from them without having to say much. I mean, that is quintessential Austin Butler. I mean, if you counted up the number of words he says, it's not going to be very much.
I know, yeah. It's one of those cases you often try to count how many lines of dialogue a person has to say that they speak a very little bit. But here it's like, how many words does he have? you can limit it down to just words and not even full lines. I mean, sometimes a line of him is just a word. He often mumbles and has very little to say, which is, again, like I said earlier, in many ways, he's the least interesting character in the movie, and somehow that makes him the most interesting character in the movie.
Yeah. The loudest he is in the film is when he goes on that rogue I guess chase through the middle of the town.
Yeah.
And the cops are after him and he goes through this school zone and we see him get all excited and he's yelling. And it does a great job of invoking how much riding bikes means to him. So it does a great job of cueing in the audience that this is something that is a major part of his identity,
right?
And he's free. You do see him kind of on cloud nine, but throughout the rest of the movie, especially as the conflict starts to raise more and more, I mean, you really start to see that stoicism really come out also more and more. And Butler's great, man. He just he radiates cool and charisma like no other.
And of course, Jodie Comer doing the exact opposite. She still radiates cool. Yeah, she still radiates like her own type of cool, but I mean, she's the speaking role. So you got Austin Butler being the complete antithesis to that, whereas Kathy is the speaking role. And I can totally see how some people might see this movie for the first time and their initial quote unquote criticism might be, oh, Kathy and that accent, nobody talks like that. And then you go and listen to the actual recordings that are available. It's like, okay, I guess people do talk like that.
Much of those criticisms evaporated immediately.
I know. I mean, but even so, whether there's truth in it or not, it just matters if the character is compelling and the diction is still pulling you in some ways. And it takes maybe 30 seconds for you to be like, I cannot take my eyes off of this person. I just need to hear what she has to say. And she always has something on her mind, and I love her performance.
Well, and that's the thing is we're also talking about a different time and place. Yeah. And while the Southern accent is still prominent, the Chicago Midwestern accent is less prominent these days. So that could be part of it where our generation, the younger generation watching this film, aren't as in tune or aware of that accent and how it's supposed to sound, and maybe that's where those criticisms come from. I don't know. I found it immediately engrossing. I loved it. I thought it was really great. I think she does a wonderful job of giving this this vibe, this incredible energy to the character, and she's doing so much voiceover that you kind of need it. It's also a big part of the film's humor and charm, that we see in those early sequences there.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that is deconstructed over the course of the film when she also gets to a breaking point and has to draw a line in the sand herself. We talked about how all of these characters, because the gang is getting out of control, they find themselves having to decide, am I going to stay in this or am I leaving? What am I doing here? And the same goes for Kathy as well, especially given, some of the things that happened to her as a result of the gang. So even though she's not in it directly, she's not out there riding with the guys, but she feels the ramifications all the same and has to tell Benny, look, I can't do this anymore. And it's fascinating to see how the film, while she still tries to maintain that energy and maintain that radiance that she has herself, it is heartbreaking to see how that slowly dissolves over the course of the film.
And I wouldn't say Kathy is someone that has control over this situation, but she has a personality and an exterior and a vibe that might suggest that, which is what I guess creates this irony and this contrast of gender norms at this time, because usually you may be perceived the masculine role as the one with the commanding presence, and especially a familial dynamic. And here is the woman that has that. So this is a film that I think is also challenging those gender roles in the 60s and early 70s by having the most commanding presence, the one with perhaps the most decision-making power, be the woman here. And I think that comes through because it's a movie about men narrated by a woman. And I think that's a really interesting touch. I think that makes for a lot of irony.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to know as well, because you make some really great points and all of that, that all, like, despite some of the things that she's fearful of in the beginning, when she starts seeing Benny, and then eventually they get married, she genuinely loves him and is more than okay with him being a part of this group. She loves being a part of the group as well. Like, she's as much drawn to the camaraderie as anyone else. I think that's why ultimately the heartbreak around the character and how things kind of crystallize at the end, why that is as devastating as it is. Is because she does want Benny to be a part. And now maybe that lessens itself a little bit after he gets injured the first time with his foot. And she has that showdown with Johnny there in the bar. At that point, that's when she's more reserved, for sure. And then she gets to that breaking point. And it is fascinating, to your point, how she seems to have a little bit more vigor in terms of the choices they make as a couple. And it's because she sees the outcomes perhaps more clearly than Benny does, because he doesn't have any sort of real aspirations and isn't willing to see outside of his little circle. Yeah. And I do find that really interesting how that comes together.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Jodie Comer. Yeah. I would have loved to see her play
Great
Sue
performance.
Storm.
Yeah. So good. Yeah. She's a treasure for sure.
Absolutely. Good movie. Good movie.
Any other final thoughts you have here on the Bikeriders?
I love the soundtrack for the film. And any movie that features bike riding, I feel like Easy Rider set this sort of precedent that anytime you see this kind of aesthetic, you automatically think of Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf. So my first thought going into this was, please don't play Born to Be Wild. Please don't do that. And they don't do it. And what I love about not doing that, and I don't know if this was Jeff Nichols' intention. In fact, if I were on that interview that you had with him, I would have probably asked him more about his choice of music and why he chose to focus more on, kind of the bluesy side of this world. We hear Roadrunner by Bo Diddley, we hear I Feel Free by Cream, and it doesn't quite have the same early heavy metal edge that a song like Born to Be Wild has. And is the point of that to suggest the early stages of the development of these biker gangs before it got a little bit more pedal to the metal and more about that exterior and more violent? Because I hear a song like Born to Be Wild, for instance, and I kind of think of the more visceral and violent qualities of this world. Whereas the soundtrack here is a bit more tender. It's a bit more soulful. And I don't know if that was the intent, to showcase, like the evolution of how this world changed and how these were people that were in the early stages of what would eventually turn into a literal gang. I don't know if there was symbolic purpose there, but I do think the soundtrack is it's very unpredictable in that regard. It's not doing what you would expect a biker movie to do as far as what songs they would choose to showcase. And I found that really refreshing. I love the soundtrack here.
Yeah, I hadn't really put much thought into it, but you make some great points. It certainly avoids the classics that you normally hear with these kinds of movies. So I do think you make a great point there. As far as my last final thought, and I hate to bring this up because I do have one, I don't want to say major, but noticeable criticism that I have to talk about.
Uh-oh.
So, Jeff, if you're listening, I love you. You mean, like, you and I are like Johnny and Benny. all joking aside. No, all joking aside.
I really hope he's not the one that has the violent streak and comes after you for what you're about to say.
No, all joking aside. I love your work. It is absolutely fantastic. And I love this movie. I love this film. But there is one thing that I have to bring up here, because Jeff does the thing that I cannot stand in movies. And that is, and this is a mild spoiler or maybe a big spoiler. Maybe it's more the latter than the former. So heads up, I guess, for this part of the conversation.
Okay.
But he does the thing where we know that a character's fate is probably coming to an end. So even though we have never seen this character spend time at home, we got to get that last shot, leaving the house. We got to plant those emotional seeds. It's something that I have talked about forever on the show as something that I despise, because I think it is a cheap tactic. What I mean specifically is there's a moment at the end of this film where Johnny is off to face the young kid in this duel at the parking lot.
Yeah.
And as he's about to leave, we get this short little sequence of him at home, and he's talking to his wife, and he's saying goodbye, and he asks about his little girls. Where are the girls? Well, they're not here, I guess, thankfully. So we can at least, maybe I can give him some credit there. We at least didn't get the girls hugging Johnny as he leaves. That kind of thing. Like movies do this all the time where, it's not about the character and their home life. And in this case, it really isn't. But that is also what makes the character fascinating. We get that early scene of him at home, and he's clearly not interested in hanging out with those girls. Even his relationship with his wife seems a little distant. But we only get the one shot of him there at home. But it does suggest that, he spends most of his time with the biker gang, and because that's his real family. Like, that's what he considers to be his real family.
Yeah.
So that's where he spends most of his time. So because, this movie isn't about him and his girls, like, I don't know why you have to, like, there's no emotional reasoning to be like, yep, we're gonna have him go and say his last goodbyes to his wife and his little girls. Like, I find it cheap. I find it extremely hollow. Like, it's a trope that exists. in a lot of movies. I have railed against it every time I see it. And as much as I love Jeff and as much as I love this film, when it happened in the theater, I admittedly did sink in my seat a little bit. I was a little deflated because it's one of the biggest things, or one of the biggest tropes that I despise the most.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. It didn't bother me as much, but I will at least agree that that moment is not necessary. Now, if that moment were maybe recontextualizing his family life a little bit more, and it was maybe first revealing to us the distance he has with his own family as opposed to his biker family, then perhaps there's more purpose in it, but it's not really telling us anything new. And the way that the scene plays out, the way the movie is playing out, it's not trying to be cryptic with what's going to happen in this final duel that we're alluding to. The film is very suggestive in how this is going to end. So there's really no surprise or anything like that, which even adds less purpose to the scene that you're talking about. So I can agree that it is, in a way, sort of purposeless. I think it may have been more effective had he just gone to visit Kathy. I think that scene between him and Kathy is very good.
One's great.
But I think in many ways that suggests some of the same things that we get with his own family there, which makes it kind of reductive. But we already kind of knew those things. So, it is a pretty reductive scene. So I don't necessarily disagree.
Yeah. The scene with Kathy, I love. Kathy is a major part of this film. She's one of the angles of the triangle. So, that's a character interaction that makes a lot of sense. And I even love how that plays out, where it's small, it's quiet. You can tell that Kathy sees something in Johnny that not everything is okay. Yeah. But Johnny, being Johnny, isn't willing to give that away.
Yeah.
You know, because he's reluctant to get into any sort of conflict. So he just kind of puts it all behind. That sequence is great. I don't mind that at all.
Right.
But having that last interaction with his wife there at the house, are you going to be home later? Can you bring home some peanut butter? It's there just to foreshadow what's about to happen, create some irony, and supplant emotional seeds based off of what's going to happen to that character. And I just find that emotionally hollow. I just don't love that in movies generally.
Yeah, but even so, that scene with his wife is not necessarily doing the work of foreshadowing what's going to happen with this duel. Before that scene even happens, we sort of get a sense of what's going to happen with this duel. At least I did. And I think this is Jeff Nichols being a really good filmmaker and tone management working certainly in his favor. He's very suggestive with where this is going to go. And maybe this is all in Tom Hardy's performance, but when he's challenged by this kid and he says fists or knives, and the kid says knives, something in Tom Hardy's reaction suggests, okay, we're cryptically being told how this is going to end. Like we sense where it's going to go. There's a devastation to it. There's an uneasy feeling that it creates. Yeah. So once again, it further makes that scene we're talking about here reductive. It just kind of repeats those same things, just adds sort of maybe that cheap layer that you're talking about.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I don't think it's the most egregious thing I've ever seen.
It's like all of a sudden this went from a 4.5 out of 5 to like a 2 out of 5 just because of
it's not that big a deal. It's just something that I find extremely annoying in films. Now, I will say the way it's handled here in the Bikeriders is less offensive because Nichols at least avoids the children, because oftentimes what these scenes involve are, our central characters, we know the doom of what's about to take place, but they got to get that one final hug with their kids in, like daddy's going off and I'll be back home tonight. And while we all know that's not going to happen, like, why are you trying to emotionally manipulate me like that when we know what's about to happen? That's the shit I can't stand when it comes to storytelling.
It's less egregious here, but it's still, I mean, we all have those tropes that we each latch onto that we just don't like in movies.
Yeah,
and that's one of them for you. Like for me, it's when dead characters narrate a movie. Like that's something I don't like in movies a lot of times. But we all have those, I guess, narrative tricks that we sometimes don't like. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But we each have that one thing that maybe just doesn't ever work for us. And this is one of those things for you. And it makes sense. It makes sense. And in the context of this movie, it's not really necessary.
Yeah, it's just, I'd say in the context of this film, the biggest hurdle I could throw at it is that it's just unnecessary.
Sure.
It's not as egregious as other examples for sure, but it doesn't add to the film at all.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I can agree with that.
That was really the only time I kind of quivered in my seat going, I don't know about that. But everything else here, for all the reasons we talked about, I pretty much love this film.
Yeah. How does it rank for you in Jeff Nichols' filmography of his 6 films? We've seen all 6 of his films. I was curious what you thought about that, if you even gave it any thought.
I haven't given it too much thought, but...
I mean, we know what number 1 is for you.
Yeah. Midnight Special, for sure. Take Shelter. Maybe Mud, number 3. I love that film a lot, too. Gotcha. I might put this at number 4. This is either 3 or 4. It's like right there with Mud. And then I would have Shotgun Stories and then Loving, or maybe Loving then Shotgun Stories. I mean, I love all of those. Don't get me wrong. But that's probably where I'm at.
When his worst film is maybe a 3.5 out of 5 on Letterboxd thus far, I'd say he's definitely doing something right. So yeah, we're not too far off. I think for me, it's Take Shelter and then Midnight Special. At this point now, I'd probably put the Bikeriders at number 3, but it's probably because it's just so fresh on my mind right now. I would admittedly, I would have to give movies like Mud and Loving and Shotgun Stories a revisit in order to know for sure. But those 3 especially are kind of the ones I feel like are almost always in flux. I like them all for different reasons. I tend to put a little bit more stock in Loving than, let's say, Mud and Shotgun Stories, primarily because I just love Ruth Negga in that film so much.
She's really great.
Yeah. Like if we're talking about maybe our top 3 favorite performances from any Jeff Nichols film, the 2 that automatically come to mind are Michael Shannon in 2 films, right? And Take Shelter and Midnight Special. And then the third one I'd probably say is Ruth Negga. Like those are the 3 I tend to gravitate towards, and her presence there, I think, maybe elevates Loving a little bit higher than the other 2 films because of her presence. At least that's my initial stand right now, but I'd have to give it a revisit to know for sure.
I mean, I think that's very fair. I mean, I'm pretty high on Sheridan and McConaughey as well. Like that was all part of the reconnaissance as well. And, you know, maybe, you know, because at that time you definitely didn't think of McConaughey giving a performance like that.
Yeah. The when that film came out, I think really helps it. And that's not to say that the movie doesn't work if it were to come out today. I think the film still works, but
I still think it's great. No,
it's still great. It just, it fit a different type of cinematic narrative, right? Like when it came out in 2013.
Yeah. I think that's why I'm probably Mud and the Bikeriders in that 3-4 slot. Okay. You know, maybe it's interchangeable, but I think confidently I can say those 2 movies fill those slots, though.
Gotcha.
And then, you know, Shotgun Stories, Loving, again, those will be my bottom 2, but I can go back and forth there as well. And again, I love both of those movies. And you're right, Ruth Negga is fantastic in Loving.
Yeah.
She's absolutely terrific in that film. So, yeah, the one thing I didn't get a chance to tell him, and I probably shouldn't have because it would have added nothing to the conversation, but I've said it before, I'll say it again. Like, I wish that I was a billionaire, because if I was, I would just fund him exclusively. Like, just make as many movies as you want. Here's $1 bazillion, go do it.
Yeah, and then he might make more things like this, because he was once tapped to be making A Quiet Place Day 1, which comes out this weekend as we're recording this. That's obviously, you know, Michael Sarnowski directing that, the man who directed Pig. Hopefully that film works out, but I have to say, if Jeff Nichols made the Bikeriders instead of A Quiet Place Day 1, and he wanted to make this movie as the reason why he chose not to make that movie, I'm glad he made that choice. I'm glad he made the choice to make the Bikeriders, because I think it's very good.
I agree. All right. Well, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please reach out to us on social media. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. All right. So we'll have the main show coming out soon as well. Maybe even the same day as this goes live. I guess it depends on how I'm feeling, how much editing I can get done. We'll see how it goes. I don't want to guarantee anything, but, I'll do my best. So,
well, you did well today, and I hope you feel better, man.
I appreciate it. Do you have any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here?
I was just going to say, once again, feel better, and I really appreciate you still being here to have the energy to talk about Jeff Nichols. If this were any other film, I feel like you would have called me and said, can't do it, we got to postpone. But somehow Jeff Nichols is just the right kind of prescribed medicine for you.
Yeah, I mean, I wish that I could have been more healthy for this conversation because, I mean, I've been looking forward to this film for so long. And then even after seeing it, I saw the film as we're recording this a week ago.
Yeah.
So I've been dying to, to talk about it and really dig into it. And, it's been so hard to find the time to write any sort of notes, to come into this with some clarity at all. Yeah, I mean, it took a lot, but, we're here.
Yeah.
We're doped up. We're great. So,
I mean, you're doped up. I'm green teed up is what I was, but we got our own vices that keep us going.
There you go. All right. Well, with all that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for bearing with me. And we'll see you guys next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Long live Jeff Nichols.
Oh, Jeff, our boy.